couple of weeks ago, Pedro contacted me and said he had an open slot that he hoped I would fill at the meeting. And I said, what do you want me to do? He said, well, I'd like somebody to reflect on the history of these conferences. Yeah. He said, well, recent history, just a few, and he clearly wanted to have some idea of sort of what the trajectory looked like coming into this meeting, and he's really interested in how we can look at all that to anticipate what we might see in the future. So that seemed good enough. So I said, how much time do I get? I said, you can have the rest of the time. So, these are mostly notes to me. In thinking about how to look at history, and I'm no historian, not as much as Harry, but I'm interested in history, so the idea of thinking about this seemed good, and it forced me to a variety of reflections, especially at this conference. The kind of question that arises quickly is what time scales are we going to talk about? So Pedro's suggestion is a few conference worths of parts of the cycle for consideration. But the question is, one question is, as you look at something like a sequence of conferences, like any kind of sequence we look at, a question is, how many of them do you have to look at to actually notice some change that you can help start getting some structure out of? And as I started to inspect the last several conferences, they looked like there was a lot of overlap in content that seemed very continuous. And it seemed a little bit like one really big conference. And I was thinking, well, how far back do you have to look to just really obviously notice a difference to get some idea of the kind of scale that we could be investigating with a longer, more serious investigation than anything I've done yet. So I thought, well, the origin of this conference was a conference at UConn, University of Connecticut, that Bill Warren and Bob Shaw organized when Bill Warren was a graduate student. And this was 1981. Okay, when they organized a conference, and that's all they had in mind. Okay, they did not have in mind another conference, and another. Okay, so look back and say, well, what was it like then? And I assure you, that was different. Okay, we can see a lot of differences in many levels. At the substantive level, Bill had just been doing his research for his dissertation on stair climbing, the affordances of stair climbing, and quantifying affordances for the first time. And the kind of question that people were asking at the conference then was, what kind of research can one do on affordances? Bill's research was important because people had been talking about affordances for a while, but there was no obvious growable research tradition. And this looked like a good place to start. But the question that was around at that time and just before it was kind of, we've got these concepts, what are we going to do? Okay? And that's really different. I mean, now we've got people with years of history of doing work on things like that and subdivisions like that. And, it's a whole different set of questions and research results that are built up. So that's only one small example of a huge difference between the world 32 years ago and now substantively. Technologically, okay, we all have our stories, and all of you at one scale or another have witnessed changes in what you can do in your research because of changes in technology. Perhaps a few people have had their research changed because technology changed in bad ways. I mean, it doesn't necessarily know. And we used to have arguments about whether you should do research on real things or computer, virtual environments. So we can still argue about that. But in 1983, at our second conference at Vanderbilt University, one of the features at that conference was a presentation of the Xerox Lisa, which was the prototype for the Macintosh. Okay? Which meant that in the 1981 conference, there was no such thing as a graphic interface on a computer. There was no such thing as a mouse. Okay? There was only typing characters on a screen, and nothing else. In fact, in Gibson's lab, if you wanted to do something graphically in graphic animation run by a computer, you had to buy time and make a trip to Bell Labs to have the one big mainframe do it for you. Okay, so that world has changed immensely. So I think we've got 32 years now of a conference every 2 years. Okay, that starts building up kind of data that you can ask rather different kinds of questions. As you find transitions that you might track, what kind of scale do they have? Okay, what goes on short time scales, like conference to conference to conference? What goes on longer time scales, like whatever, maybe every 10 years, 15 years? Okay. Okay. There could be a variety of nested cycles going on that would be rather interesting to notice. One time I asked our dear old friend Arthur Immerall to comment on the work of Michael Turvey and Peter Kugler on the swinging pendulum paradigm, which where many of the ideas that Peter worked out and worked with Michael and with Arthur, many of the ideas, they were inspired by Arthur. But he read a paper, one of their papers about swinging pendulums. Many of you know this kind of research. And Ibby said, it's useless. I can't find out anything from this. He said, they've got to swing the pendulums for 5 hours before I can find out anything. Because he wanted cycles at a lot of different time scales. And the time scale of what typically is looking at is a few minutes at most, and they'll be doing it for 5 hours. Then we can get something. Okay, so we should have these conferences for 100 years, and then we can see the pattern. I'll get to that a little later. So I'm about to show you some of the book covers from the last 5 as we look quickly at the last 5 of these conferences, plus this one is the 6th. So we're going back 10 years. But I want to note again historically for you that we didn't have any poster books. There weren't any books for the conference for several years until the Dutch got ambitious and put them together and made a real book out of the conference presentations at Amsterdam, which was the 6th of these conferences, okay, ICPA 6. Oh yeah, the 5 is the reference. Len Mark at number 5 had put together a nice big book of things, but it wasn't like a publication. So, so the very first book came at ICPA 6, and that's where the numbering starts because the publishers were kind of keeping track of the books, so that means that whenever you get the book that goes with the conference, if you want to know which conference it goes, you know, how they match, backwards in formula is you take the number of the conference minus 5, and that gives you the book. Okay. So we're at ICPA 17, take away 5, that means the book will say Studies in Action Perception 12. Okay, so this is the array, and I'll just say something briefly to get you started thinking about each of these. Starting, so this is 2003, we're going to look at 10 years ago. This is the conference called Treffner Organized in Australia, followed by a conference in the number 14 was organized by Larry Rosenblum in California. 14 we had in Yokohama, Japan, which was very important to have our great Japanese colleagues finally not have to travel, or not travel so much. 15 was Tom Stockhagen and Mike Wade in Minnesota, and this will be the location of the next one. This is 16, our last one is in Brazil, and 17 is now. So each of these conferences have special qualities as well as some constant qualities. Keep in mind, I'll say what that is in a second, keep in mind that each of these conferences is organized by volunteers who are in a particular situation with particular people around them and close to them, both intellectually and geographically, and we, so that will affect each of these conferences. So everyone has an understandable and desirable flavor of its location, as well as constants that you can find over and over throughout the conference. I'm not going to say very much about the constants because they're constant because you kind of know them. So there's a lot of coordination dynamics, a lot of now actually social coordination, a somewhat regular set of developmental papers. So the things around that you can count on being at these conferences, and then there's some other things. Just to give you some track, some sort of anchor on what happens at these, I've given you a rough count of the number of talks and posters at each of these conferences. The posters are a little underestimated because sometimes I just have the book to count from and not all the posters that were actually presented. So that 40 number in Minnesota is low because it's just the number in the book, but I didn't have any other information at the time. Okay, so you see this sort of tracks across, again, the number of talks and the number of posters at the sessions. To give you an idea of what might have been going on at some of these conferences, I'll focus mainly on lists of symposium or session topics. So I didn't have time to track all of the posters, but I thought this would at least give you a start, some idea. But I also tracked by people. A lot of what you know, if you really want to track something kind of developmentally, you're going to have to track sometimes very specific programs. So I started tracking sort of who was present at all of these conferences for about 50 people, to give you some idea. There are 4 of us here who have been to every ICPA. Since we're counting this one, that means there can't be anybody else. So I'm one, Claudia, and Michael, and Claire. But in the set that we're looking at, and Carrie Marsh has been to all of them. I think several of our Japanese colleagues have been to all of them. Hiro, Ito-san, and I think for the all of them. So, and so we've got a number of people here who've had programs that can be tracked fairly closely. We do that. So, just again, give you quick thumbnail sketches. This is a list of topics in 10 years ago. In Australia, 2003, Paul Treffner's organization. Okay, sometimes you can tell what these are about from the titles, sometimes you can't. But I also have a few sort of highlight kinds of things that are partly what I remember, partly what are obviously crucial to the conference. So within this range of topics, one of the things that was done at this conference was time to honor Eleanor Gibson, where a lot of, actually she had passed away the year before. So we had assembled some home movies of the Gibsons, some pictures, and had some commentary devoted to her in the program. We had guests at all these conferences. We always have some outside guests who are not really an ongoing part of this community, but who relate to it very well. We had Barbara Gillam, an Australian perceptionist, and Mandian Srinivasan, who's a wonderful student of bees and has studied bees guidance in flow fields, like, had a lot to do with working with Bill Warren on that. There were several sections on robotics, and that comes and goes. There we have robotics at these conferences more and less, but it's certainly a topic that's around. We have had several company representatives talking about technology of interest. One was self-parking cars at that session. There was one session that was some Australians that did interesting brain work. So there's a whole, you don't see brain sessions on these very often, but they're not unprecedented. And then there was an artist named John D. Keane who appeared for the first time there and came to several other conferences representing some very interesting work. So the list here for the California meeting, so that was ICPA 13 in 2005. Got a little longer, so I needed 2 columns. I'm certainly not going through all of those, but you can pick out your favorites if you scan well. Things that occurred somewhat specially at this meeting were an evening session devoted called Remembering Jimmy Gibson. where people who knew Gibbs or were his students got together and talked about it. The Japanese group filmed the whole thing and made it available to us, and a small format version is linked to our website. So there's a lot there. There was a piece, one of the symposium topics was ground theory. There are some perceptionists in the world who had taken Gibson's idea about the importance of the ground importantly and done psychophysics with that. This was notable because the strict kind of early Gibson research on perception is not something we see a lot in our conferences. And that's probably got a lot of historical reasons, but the emphasis on action and perception has moved away from a lot of papers on perception strictly. But there was a session like that at the California meeting. Robotics was well represented there by Michio Okada, who I first met at Eric's ATR, and who then later came to visit Connecticut, and he was interested in social robotics and designed a friendly little robot called New that he said was inspired by Ed Reed, which sort of stunned me because he was an engineer in Japan telling me that Ed Reed was his inspiration. So we moved there we actually got to go to Japan, to Yokohama. The Japanese put on a wonderful set of sessions, and some of the distinctive parts of the program there were, there was a special program component to honor Ed Reed. There were several robotic sessions. We got some great exposure to Japanese artists, designers, and architects. So we have a fair amount of art going through the history of our conferences, but it's not every time. Okay, we had a lot of Dave Lee there, as some will remember. And we still have a lot of Dave Lee represented by the former students and colleagues, but he and his work, and he brought several of his students to be part of his symposium, were a big part of that conference. At Minnesota, for number 15, Tom Stockregan and Mike Wade had a lot to do with the program. One early item on the program was recognizing 25 years of research following up on Bill Warren's first stair work. I mentioned that earlier, so we actually organized something around that. Being at Minnesota, and Tom, there was a lot of research on posture and postural control. And finally, there was a very nice session on music, led by a then new member of our society who was a concert pianist, who had a lot to say about an ecological attitude towards musical performance. So we do that sometimes too. Again, not so much every time, but that came into some focus at the Minnesota program. Finally, we moved to Brazil. Got Sergio and Michael presenting integrity for a major topic. Okay, we had music and speech. We had work related to various pathologies, which has certainly come up several times in our conferences. That was a big part of the Japanese conference as well, and some of this conference. The introduction to physical intelligence, since that was just getting organized, was presented there. Michael presented a more mature version of that this time. So finally we come here. Okay, we have, there's a sampling of topics here. And what do we have? We've got group processes, and we've got team sports. And we're reflecting the interest and expertise of where we are in a very nice and appropriate way. We have the guests in the ethnography section to bring new things in, people that we're not necessarily expecting back every time, but that's the kind of infusion that gives added life to many of the things that go on here. So I had a little conversation with Richard Schmidt this morning about how you think about these things. History is often thought of by people outside as a pretty linear narrative process. Something starts, it develops, and it degrades, and that's it. But the Iberol, and I think an attitude that's around here a lot, is to look for cycles, look for things that repeat and come and go, and you do that, you get various time scales. So if we really want to get into things and think about the longer time scales, then we have to think about how we would measure them. And one of the things Richard was commenting on was the fact that much of what we're doing right now is fairly limited in the time scale of the patterns that we're seeing. And one of the challenges we might think about, given we're thinking historically anyway, is how can we stretch our dynamics and our perspective into the longer time scales. Okay, it's like Arthur said, 5 hours. So stuff.
Thank you.
Summary? You're going to have a nap.